The sun had barely broken the horizon when Daniel Hayes, a ranch hand of modest means and quiet disposition, began his chores at the sprawling Double Creek Ranch. He was the kind of man who never complained, no matter how hard the work or how long the day stretched. His hands were calloused from roping and branding, and his back bore the ache of endless labor, but his spirit had remained unbroken by the harshness of frontier life. Daniel believed in decency above all else, even in a land where decency was often mistaken for weakness. That morning, as he led a skittish colt down to the watering trough, his sharp eyes caught movement near the mesquite trees at the edge of the pasture. At first he thought it was a coyote nosing around, but then he heard a soft, pitiful whimper. Curious, Daniel tied the colt and walked closer. There, in the shade of a scrubby bush, lay a dog, lean, dusty, and trembling with exhaustion. Its fur was streaked with blood from a deep gash on its flank, and its breathing was ragged. Daniel crouched low, speaking gently. "Easy now, fella," he murmured, his voice calm like he was soothing a nervous horse. The dog flinched, baring its teeth in a flash of fear, but there was no real strength behind the snarl. Daniel took his hat off slowly and set it on the ground as if to show he meant no harm. Inch by inch, he drew closer until he could see a leather thong around the dog's neck, decorated with beads and carvings, unmistakably Apache in origin. He froze for a moment, realizing what this meant. This wasn't some stray or ranch dog gone astray. It belonged to the Apache camp beyond the ridge, a people both feared and mistrusted by the settlers and ranchers of the territory. Helping the Apache in any form was considered foolish, even dangerous. But as Daniel looked into the dog's dark, pain-filled eyes, he couldn't turn away. Frontier law might be built on suspicion and division, but his own heart followed a different code. Carefully, Daniel slipped off his neckerchief and approached with slow steps. "Easy, boy. I ain't gonna hurt you," he whispered. The dog shivered but did not move. Daniel knelt beside it and pressed the cloth against the wound, stemming the flow of blood. The dog whimpered, then surprisingly pressed its head weakly against his hand, as though recognizing the kindness. Daniel worked with patience, tearing strips from his undershirt to wrap the wound more tightly. He fetched water from his canteen and coaxed the dog to drink, then sprinkled the rest over its head to cool it from the rising heat of the desert morning. The colt whinnied in the distance, uneasy at being left, but Daniel stayed focused, his hands gentle and steady. As he worked, his mind drifted. He had heard plenty of stories about the Apache, fierce warriors, proud and unyielding in the face, of settlers who pressed further into their lands. Most ranchers spoke of them with bitterness, sometimes hatred. Yet here was one of their animals, hurt and alone, and Daniel saw no enemy in it. He only saw a creature in need. After some time, the dog's breathing steadied. It tried to rise, but its legs buckled, and Daniel quickly supported it. "No, you just rest," he said softly. He decided to hide the dog in the shade of the barn, away from the prying eyes of his fellow ranch hands, and more importantly, the wrath of the ranch owner, Mr. Whitfield. The man was notorious for his temper, and Daniel knew exactly how he would react if he discovered that one of his workers had aided an Apache's animal. With careful strength, Daniel carried the dog to the barn, laying it on a bed of hay. He slipped the beaded collar back over its neck, knowing it would be the only way for the Apache to claim their companion later. He even shared a strip of jerky from his own meager lunch pouch, which the dog ate with slow, grateful bites. As the morning sun climbed higher, Daniel returned to his chores, his secret hidden among the shadows of the barn. He worked harder than usual, hoping no one would notice the time he had stolen away. But inside, he felt a quiet satisfaction, a sense that he had done the right thing, regardless of the risks. He knew the frontier was a place where survival often hardened men, where compassion was mocked as weakness, but he couldn't deny his own nature. In the dog's eyes, he had seen something rare and pure. Trust, born out of desperation. For Daniel, that trust was worth more than the approval of any ranch boss. He didn't know it yet, but this simple act of kindness would soon alter the course of his life. By nightfall, whispers would spread, and by morning the consequences of his choice would come crashing down with the force of thunder. But for now, as he mucked the stalls and fed the horses, Daniel felt the smallest flicker of peace. The wounded animal was safe, its heartbeat strong again, and he had been the one to give it another chance. In a land filled with cruelty, Daniel Hayes had chosen mercy. And mercy, though fragile, carried power far greater than he could imagine. By late afternoon, the blazing sun had scorched the land into shimmering waves of heat. Daniel Hayes had spent the better part of the day working harder than usual, hoping to avoid suspicion. He had carried water, patched fences, and tended to the cattle with a quiet urgency, his thoughts constantly drifting back to the barn where the injured Apache dog lay hidden in the shadows of the hayloft. Each time he stole a glance, he was relieved to see the animal resting peacefully, its breathing steadier, its eyes brighter. Daniel believed no one had noticed his absence earlier that morning, but in the harsh and watchful world of the Double Creek Ranch, secrets were difficult to keep. At supper, the men gathered at the mess hall, a long shack with open windows that barely kept out the heat. The ranch hands hunched over tin plates of beans and salt pork, speaking in low voices. Rumors traveled quickly among men who had little else to talk about, and Daniel sensed the buzz before he even sat down. A few men glanced his way, their eyes narrowing, but they said nothing. Then came the heavy tread of boots on the wooden floor, boots that everyone recognized. Mr. Whitfield, the ranch owner, was not a man who mingled with his workers. He was tall, sharp-shouldered, and carried himself with the arrogance of one who believed the land and everyone on it existed for his profit. His mustache was trimmed with military precision, and his cold gray eyes missed nothing. When Whitfield entered a room, silence followed like a shadow. "Hayes!" he barked, his voice carrying above the clatter of tin plates. Daniel froze with a fork halfway to his mouth. "Yes, sir?" "Step outside." The ranch hands exchanged wary glances, but no one dared speak. Daniel set his plate down and followed the boss into the fading light. Whitfield didn't stop until they reached the front of the corral, where the smell of dust and horse sweat hung in the air. He turned sharply, his face twisted with controlled fury. "I'll ask this once," Whitfield said. "Did you have anything to do with that mongrel I found in my barn today?" Daniel's heart sank. He had underestimated Whitfield's vigilance. The man inspected everything on his property like a hawk watching a field mouse, and he had clearly discovered the dog. "Yes, sir," Daniel admitted, standing straight. Lying would do him no good. "It was hurt. I couldn't just leave it to die out there." Whitfield's eyes flashed. "That wasn't some stray cur, Hayes. That dog belongs to the Apache." He spat the word like venom. "You brought their filth onto my land. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniel swallowed hard, but kept his voice calm. "I know. It's theirs. That's why I couldn't turn my back. It was suffering. Doesn't matter who it belonged to. It needed help." Whitfield's face darkened. He stepped closer until his shadow fell over Daniel. "You fool! Do you think those savages would show you the same mercy if they found you bleeding in the dirt? They'd scalp you without a thought, and you know it." "Maybe so," Daniel replied evenly, "but right is right. That dog didn't ask for who it was born to. It just needed a hand." Whitfield's fury boiled over. He slammed his fist into the corral rail, startling the horses within. "I run this ranch, Hayes. Not you, not your bleeding heart, and sure as hell not the Apache. We don't show them kindness. We show them strength. And if you can't understand that, you've got no place here." The words hit Daniel like a hammer, though he had half expected them. Losing a job on the frontier wasn't just about wages. It meant losing shelter, food, and safety in a land where survival was never guaranteed. Still, he met Whitfield's glare without flinching. "You're firing me, then?" "You're—" "Damn right I am," Whitfield snarled. "Pack your gear tonight and be gone by sunrise. If I see you still on my property after that, you'll regret it." Daniel nodded slowly. "Understood." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the ranch owner's fury clashing with the ranch hand's quiet resolve. Finally, Whitfield turned on his heel and stalked away, muttering curses under his breath. Daniel remained by the corral, his chest heavy with a mix of dread and defiance. He knew Whitfield was wrong, but that didn't lessen the sting of being cast out. The whispers of the other ranch hands drifted faintly from the mess hall. He could imagine what they were saying, that Daniel was a fool, that he had brought this upon himself, that no man in his right mind risked his livelihood for the sake of an Apache's dog. As night fell, Daniel packed his few belongings into a worn saddlebag. He checked on the dog one last time, stroking its head gently. Its eyes met his with a quiet gratitude, as if it understood what he had sacrificed. "Rest easy, boy," Daniel whispered. "You'll be going home soon. And me, well, I'll find my own way." The night air on the Double Creek Ranch was cooler than the scorching day, but for Daniel Hayes it carried no comfort. He sat on the edge of his bunk, a small oil lamp burning low beside him, packing the few belongings he owned into a worn leather saddlebag, a spare shirt, a Bible with its pages frayed at the corners, a pocket knife, and a handful of coins, the sum of his worldly goods. Each item he packed seemed to remind him of the life he was being forced to leave behind. The bunkhouse was hushed, though Daniel knew the men were awake. He could feel their eyes on him from the shadows, some curious, others quietly scornful. No one spoke a word, but their silence was louder than any insult. To them, Daniel was already a ghost, a man who had made a foolish choice, a man who had no future among them. Finally, one of the younger hands, a wiry fellow named Clem, cleared his throat. "You really did it, didn't you? Helped one of their dogs?" Daniel didn't look up from his saddlebag. "I did what needed doing." Clem shook his head, whistling low. "Ain't worth it. Apache don't thank nobody. You'll see. Out here, kindness don't buy a man a meal." The older hands muttered agreement. Another voice, gruff and bitter, chimed in from the corner. "Whitfield was right to toss you. You bring an Apache animal into this ranch, might as well invite the whole tribe to ride through the gate." Daniel stood and shouldered his bag. He looked around at the faces in the dim light, men who had shared long days in the saddle, dust storms, and cattle drives. Men he had sweated beside, men who had once nodded to him as one of their own. Now their expressions were closed, hardened, as if his decision to show mercy had turned him into something foreign, untrustworthy. "I don't expect you to understand," Daniel said quietly. "But a man's got to live by what he knows is right, even if it costs him." No one answered. The silence was his only reply. By dawn, Daniel was gone. He saddled his bay horse, a sturdy gelding named Copper, and rode out before the first light touched the hills. He didn't look back at the bunkhouse, nor at the sprawling ranch house that loomed in the distance. He had no desire to see Whitfield's face again, no interest in hearing the finality of the heavy gates shutting behind him. As he rode through the empty scrubland, shame clung to him like dust. It wasn't the shame of helping the dog. He would never regret that. But the shame of being cast out like a criminal, of knowing his name would be whispered with ridicule among men he had once worked alongside. He imagined the stories that would spread. Hayes was fired for siding with the Apache. Hayes was too soft for ranch life. Hayes put a dog above his own kind. By mid-morning, Daniel reached a low ridge overlooking the valley. From there he could see the land stretch out endlessly, broken only by the thin ribbon of the river and the distant blue smudge of mountains. Somewhere beyond those mountains lay Apache territory, and he wondered if the dog he had saved had already been missed. He dismounted and let Copper graze while he sat on a rock, staring at the horizon. The coins in his pocket wouldn't last long. Without work, he had no way to feed himself or his horse. The nearest town was a 2-day ride, but even there, word of Whitfield's anger would likely precede him. Few ranchers dared hire a man who had defied one of the wealthiest landowners in the territory. Still, despite the uncertainty pressing in on him, Daniel felt a strange sense of calm. He had chosen mercy, and though it had cost him everything familiar, it had also freed him from a life lived under another man's cruelty. That afternoon, as the sun slid low, he camped near the river. He built a small fire and ate a meager supper of beans from a tin. The quiet of the wilderness wrapped around him, broken only by the rustle of the river reeds and the cry of a hawk overhead. In the firelight, he replayed Whitfield's words. In his mind, "We don't show them kindness. We show them strength." Daniel clenched his fists. Strength without compassion was no strength at all. It was just fear in disguise. Little did he know, the story of his kindness had already traveled further than the ranch. By nightfall, it had reached ears that would not ignore it. The Apache had learned that one white man had chosen to act differently, and their response would shake the Double Creek Ranch to its very foundation. For now, though, Daniel sat alone beneath the wide sweep of stars, a man cast out in shame, yet unknowingly standing on the edge of a destiny far greater than he could imagine. Far beyond the Double Creek Ranch, beyond the mesas and dry riverbeds where cactus stood like watchmen of the desert, the Apache camp stirred with its own rhythm. Fires burned low as women pounded maize into meal, children darted between the brush shelters, and the men sharpened their weapons or tended to the horses. Life here was both simple and relentless, shaped by the unforgiving land and the ever-present threat of encroaching settlers. That evening, an elder warrior named Nantan noticed something unusual. His daughter's dog, a sleek animal named Dakota, friend to all, had not returned home. The dog was more than a companion. It was a guardian for the children and a creature woven into the spirit of the family. Dakota had gone missing 2 nights earlier, and though the camp had searched, they had found no trace but scattered paw prints near the cattle ranges of Whitfield's ranch. The people gathered around the fire speaking in hushed tones. Some suspected that settlers had taken or killed the dog, as often happened when animals strayed too near ranch land. Others feared the dog had fallen prey to coyotes. Nantan's daughter wept softly, clutching the beaded collar Dakota often wore. But before despair could take root, a young scout galloped into camp, his horse kicking up a cloud of dust. He carried news. The dog had been seen alive, in the hands of a ranch hand who had treated its wounds. The scout had spoken with a trader in the nearby town who claimed to have overheard Whitfield himself raging about it. The camp grew still. Warriors exchanged glances, their expressions unreadable. In most tales that reached them, settlers showed cruelty, not mercy. The idea that a white man had carried their dog to safety, had dressed its wounds instead of driving it off, stirred surprise and suspicion. The Apache chief, Cochise, sat quietly before the fire. His face was weathered by years of battle and hardship, his eyes sharp as an eagle's. He had lived long enough to see treaties broken and lands stolen, long enough to learn that words of kindness from settlers often came with hidden blades. Yet he also believed in balance, in the idea that every action carried weight in the spirit world. He raised his hand, silencing the camp. "Tell me again," he said to the scout, his voice low but steady. The scout repeated what he had heard. That the man was named Daniel Hayes, a worker on Whitfield's ranch, that he had risked his position to tend to the dog, and that for his act Whitfield had thrown him out like a thief. The chief's gaze lingered on the beaded collar lying in the young girl's lap. He knew the dog was more than just an animal. It carried meaning, as protector, as family, as a thread connecting the people to the natural world. To harm such a creature was to invite misfortune. To save one, that was something else entirely. Nantan spoke, his voice rough with grief, but tinged with hope. This haze, he showed kindness where there was no gain for him. For that, he was punished by his own kind. Is this not a sign? The camp murmured in agreement, though some remained doubtful. Perhaps it is a trick, one warrior said. Perhaps he only wished to earn our favor. Another shook his head. If that were true, would Whitfield have cast him out? No. This was not for us. It was for the dog, for the simple reason that his heart could not do otherwise. Cochise considered their words. Then he spoke slowly, each syllable deliberate. In a land where cruelty rules, even the smallest act of mercy shines brighter than fire. If this man has suffered for helping one of our own, then it is not him who should feel shame. It is Whitfield. And Whitfield must see what it means when you strike down one who acts with honor. The people listened closely. They knew what Cochise was suggesting. The weight of his words carried more than gratitude. They carried intent. The following morning, riders left camp to track Daniel Hayes, to see if he still walked the land or if he had already vanished into the wilderness. Others prepared horses, bows, and rifles, not for war, not yet, but for presence, for the message that must be delivered. By dusk, 300 Apache warriors stood ready. Painted faces glimmered in the firelight, feathers swayed in the wind, and the sound of their horses echoed like thunder through the valley. They would ride, not for vengeance, but for honor. To show Whitfield that one man's compassion had not gone unseen, and that the Apache did not forget kindness, even in times of conflict. As the camp gathered for the final council, Cochise placed his hand on Nantan's shoulder. Tomorrow, he said, the settlers will learn that mercy is not weakness. They will learn that we honor those who honor us. In the shadows, the young girl smiled through her tears, clutching Takoda, close to her chest. The dog, still weary but alive, wagged its tail gently, unaware of the storm its survival had set in motion. And so, as stars spread like scattered fire across the night sky, the Apache prepared to ride, their numbers vast, their purpose clear. The land itself seemed to tremble, as though it knew that the dawn would carry with it a reckoning unlike any the Double Creek Ranch had ever seen. The night before, the great ride was alive with firelight and whispers. The Apache warriors sat in circles, sharpening their knives and checking the bindings of their arrows, while their horses grazed on the sparse grass at the edge of camp. Every so often a low song would rise, a chant to the spirits, to the ancestors, to the earth itself. It was not a song of war, but of purpose. At the center of the camp, near the largest fire, Chief Cochise sat in silence. His broad shoulders were wrapped in a cloak of deer hide, his long hair braided with eagle feathers that swayed in the desert wind. His eyes reflected the flames, deep and unblinking, as if he were staring into the future itself. Around him, the council of elders waited patiently. The fate of one white man was not a matter to take lightly. Many among the elders argued that Daniel Hayes was just that, one man. His kindness was rare, yes, but what difference did it make in the grand struggle between Apache and settler? Could a single act outweigh decades of betrayal and bloodshed? An elder named Taza leaned forward, his face lined by years of hardship. Cochise, he said, his voice gravelly, we cannot be blinded by sentiment. The settlers take and take. Today they drive cattle through our hunting lands. Tomorrow they will build towns where our children once played. If this Hayes showed kindness, it was his choice. But it changes nothing of the greater truth. 1. Good man cannot stop the tide of many. The camp fell quiet at his words. Many nodded in agreement. The Apache had lost much: their freedom to roam, their sacred places, their families to raids and soldiers. No kindness from outsiders had reversed that pain. But then Nantan rose, Dakota, the dog, at his side. The animal still bore its bandages, tail wagging faintly as it pressed against his leg. Nantan's voice was low but steady. This man Hayes saw no profit in saving Dakota. He knew it would cost him, and it did. Whitfield, his own kind, cast him out like a stray. If we forget such an act, if we treat it as nothing, then we are no different than those who see no value in mercy. Shall we allow Whitfield to believe his cruelty is the only power that matters? Murmurs spread among the warriors. Some nodded, others frowned. The question struck deep. Apache law was unwritten, but it was rooted in honor. Honor to family, honor to spirit, honor to those who stood with courage, even if they were outsiders. Finally, all eyes turned to Cochise. He had listened quietly, weighing the arguments. Now he stood, tall and commanding. His voice carried with it the authority of a man who had seen much, endured much, and never bent to injustice. "You speak true, Taza," he said. "One man cannot stop the tide. But a tide is made of many drops. And when one drop shines brighter than the rest, the spirits take notice." This Hayes acted with a heart that was not poisoned by fear. He chose the path of life, not death. And for this, his own people cast him away. He paused, scanning the circle of warriors, his gaze sharp as an arrowhead. If we turn our backs on such a man, then we tell the spirits that mercy has no meaning. We tell Whitfield and those like him that cruelty wins, that honor has no voice. I will not let that be our message. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks into the night sky. Cochise lifted his hand, his voice rising like the desert wind. Tomorrow we ride. Not for vengeance, not for blood. We ride to show Whitfield that one man's kindness is worth 300 warriors' respect. We ride to honor Hayes and to remind the settlers that strength is not found in cruelty, but in the power to show mercy. The warriors erupted in approval, striking their fists against their chests, raising their voices in a chant that echoed across the valley. Horses neighed and stamped the earth, as though they, too, understood the decision. That night, the camp did not sleep much. Warriors painted their faces, mothers prepared food for the journey, and elders sang prayers to bless the ride. Daniel Hayes's name was spoken with reverence, though he had no knowledge of it. He slept alone by the river, unaware that an entire nation of riders was preparing to defend the honor he had unknowingly earned. Before the fire died low, Cochise sat with Nantan and placed a hand on his shoulder. Tomorrow, Whitfield will learn the difference between fear and respect, and Hayes will learn that no act of kindness is ever forgotten by the people. The chief looked up at the stars, their cold light unchanging against the dark sky. For years he had fought to protect his people. For years he had seen cruelty returned for every gesture of peace. But tonight was different. Tonight, the spirits had shown him that even in the harshest land, a single spark of mercy could ignite a fire strong enough to move nations. And so, the decision was made. At first light, 300 warriors would ride, not to bring death, but to bring a message, one the Double Creek Ranch and its master would never forget. The morning after Daniel Hayes rode away, the Double Creek Ranch felt different. The air itself seemed uneasy, as if the land was holding its breath. The ranch hands went about their duties, mending fences, driving cattle, and checking water troughs. But their movements were stiff, their eyes often wandering toward the distant hills. Something unseen pressed on them, and though no one could name it, everyone felt it. Mr. Whitfield, however, had no doubt what it was. To him, danger was always lurking just beyond the ridgeline, waiting for the smallest excuse to descend upon his ranch. And now, with Hayes's foolish act, he was certain that excuse had been given. By mid-morning, Whitfield summoned his foreman, Rourke, to the veranda of the big ranch house. Rourke was a grizzled Irishman with a scar across his cheek and a voice like gravel. He had been Whitfield's right hand for years, a man who followed orders without hesitation. "They'll come," Whitfield said, pacing with a cigar clenched between his teeth. "Mark me, Rourke, the Apache will come. That dog he smuggled into my barn was theirs. Hayes may have thought he was being merciful, but all he did was throw my name in the mud with those savages. They'll take it as weakness. Weakness invites blood." Rourke rubbed his chin. "Might be, sir, but we've had no sign of them. Could be they don't even know." Whitfield rounded on him, his voice sharp. "Don't play the fool. They always know. You can't sneeze in this valley without an Apache scout seeing it. They'll be watching us now, deciding whether to strike. And when they do, it'll be on my head if this ranch isn't ready." By noon, the orders were clear. Every ranch hand was to arm himself. Rifles were taken from storage, ammunition counted, and sentries posted on the ridges. The men muttered among themselves as they cleaned their weapons, their unease growing. Clem, the youngest hand, spoke what many were thinking. "You reckon they'll come for Hayes or for us?" Rourke snorted. "Boy, they don't care about Hayes. He's nothing to them. But Whitfield's right about one thing. The Apache don't forget. They'll come for the ranch. Make no mistake." The words spread like wildfire, igniting fear. Men began imagining raids in the night, burning, barns, cattle scattered, arrows whistling through the dark. Some thought of deserting, but fear of Whitfield's wrath kept them in line. Whitfield himself was a storm that day. He strode about the ranch barking orders, his temper short and his eyes restless. He cursed Hayes at every turn, blaming him for the danger. "The damn fool brought this on us," he growled. "Helping their dog. Who in his right mind risks his life for an animal that belongs to the enemy?" Yet beneath his bluster, there was fear. Whitfield had built his fortune by driving cattle across Apache lands, showing no respect for their boundaries. He knew the resentment that simmered in every canyon and hollow. Deep down, he feared not only attack but humiliation. The idea that his men might see him powerless in the face of an enemy he claimed to dominate. As the sun dipped low, the tension grew heavier. Sentries reported strange movements on the horizon, dust rising where no cattle grazed, the flicker of distant campfires on the ridges. No Apache riders approached, but the signs were there, just enough to stoke the men's nerves. That evening in the bunkhouse, the talk was grim. Clem, staring into the lantern light, whispered, "What if Hayes was right? What if helping that dog was the decent thing, and now we're the ones bringing trouble by casting him out?" One of the older hands spat on the floor. "Decency don't keep you alive out here, boy. Steel does. Hayes forgot that, and now he's out there in the dirt with nothing but his conscience to keep him warm. You do well not to follow his example." But even as the men tried to convince themselves, doubt gnawed at them. Deep inside, they feared that Whitfield's cruelty had invited something far greater than they could fight with rifles. By nightfall, the ranch was a fortress of fear. Fires burned at every corner, rifles leaned against doorways, horses were corralled close. The men did not laugh or sing as they sometimes did after a long day. They waited, silent and watchful, for a storm they could not see but felt coming. And far away, across the hills, 300 Apache warriors sat astride their horses, their silhouettes black against the rising moon. They did not move, did not shout. They waited with the patience of hunters, letting the fear seep deep into the ranch like smoke before fire. The stage was set. Whitfield thought himself prepared for war, but he could not imagine what would arrive with the dawn. Not death, but something he feared more. Respect demanded at the edge of his own gate. The dawn came slowly, a pale wash of light spreading over the desert, turning the mesas into hulking shadows against the horizon. At the Double Creek Ranch, no man slept soundly that night. Some dozed with rifles across their laps. Others lay, awake, staring into the rafters, ears straining for the faintest sound of movement in the dark. By first light, the men were already on edge. Whitfield himself stood on the veranda of his ranch house, his cigar clenched tight between his teeth, the smoke curling around his hardened face. His eyes darted constantly toward the eastern ridge, where the land rolled out in endless waves of scrub and rock. He felt it in his bones. Something was coming. The first sign was faint, almost easy to miss, a tremor underfoot, like the earth shifting in its sleep. Clem, posted at the north fence line, frowned and pressed his hand to the ground. His eyes widened. It wasn't just a tremor, it was rhythm. Hoofbeats. "Rourke!" he shouted, scrambling to his feet. "They're coming!" The words spread like wildfire through the ranch. Men scrambled for their rifles, stumbling from their posts to gather at the gates. Horses in the corral whinnied nervously, ears flicking, toward the sound. Even the cattle, grazing in the lower pasture, raised their heads as though they too sensed the storm approaching. Then came the dust, a long rising plume stretching across the horizon, backlit by the newborn sun. It glowed golden at first, then darker, heavier, as though the earth itself was being torn open. The sound grew louder with every heartbeat. Thunder, deep and rolling, shaking the air, the ground, the very lungs in the men's chests. The ranch. Hands stood frozen at the gate, their rifles clutched tightly, eyes straining to make sense of the shadow within the dust cloud. Whitfield pushed his way to the front, his voice sharp with both command and fear. "Hold steady! Don't fire till I say!" And then they saw them. At first it was a blur. Shapes emerging from the haze, dark figures on horseback, their silhouettes, multiplied by the rising sun. Then, clear as day, 300 Apache warriors rode over the ridge in perfect unison, their horses pounding the earth in a relentless wave. Painted faces flashed red, black, and white, feathers streamed from their hair, and spears and rifles gleamed in the morning light. The sight stole the breath from every man on the ranch. It was not a raiding party. It was an army. The ranch hands whispered prayers, their knuckles white on the stocks of their guns. Clem swallowed hard, his voice breaking in the silence. "There's too many. Lord help us. There's too many." Whitfield's jaw tightened, his bravado fighting against the dread clawing at his chest. He had always spoken of the Apache, as if they were animals, scattered bands who could be driven off with a show of force. But this was something else. This was organized, deliberate, overwhelming. The warriors did not attack. They did not scream or loose arrows. They rode as one, a living wall of horse and man, their hoofbeats crashing like a drumbeat of judgment. Closer they came, until the dust stung the eyes of the ranch hands and the thunder drowned out every thought. When at last they drew near the gates, the warriors pulled their horses up in a sudden unified motion. The sound of hundreds of hooves stopping at once shook the earth. Dust billowed high, settling over the ranch like a curtain of smoke. Silence followed. Heavy, suffocating silence. The Apache sat tall in their saddles, faces painted, eyes hard. 300 pairs of eyes fixed on Whitfield and his men, who stood trembling behind the fence. The ranch hands had their rifles ready, but none dared raise them. The sheer weight of the warrior's presence pressed down like a mountain. Cochise himself rode forward, his great horse gleaming with sweat, feathers swaying in his hair. He carried no rifle, only a spear painted with red bands. He raised it high, not in threat, but in signal. Behind him, the warriors sat motionless, their discipline more terrifying than any wild charge could have been. Whitfield swallowed hard. His voice, usually booming, cracked as he called out, "What do you want here?" But Cochise did not answer immediately. He sat in silence, his dark eyes burning into Whitfield's. The pause was deliberate, stretching the fear until every man at the ranch felt it coil tight inside his chest. Daniel Hayes, camped miles away by the river, could not hear the thunder, but he would hear of it soon enough. For now, it was Whitfield who faced the reckoning, staring into the eyes of 300 riders who had come not to burn, not to steal, but to remind him that respect could not be bought, only earned, and that cruelty carried a cost. The air hung heavy, waiting for the first word, the first gesture, that would decide whether the day ended in peace or blood. For several long moments after the Apache halted at the gates, silence ruled the land. It was a silence heavier than gunfire, a silence that squeezed the heart and turned sweat cold on the skin. Every man on the Double Creek Ranch stood stiff, gripping his rifle, eyes darting between Whitfield, Cochise, and the wall of warriors, stretching across the horizon. The ranch hands had expected a charge, a storm of arrows and bullets, a fiery raid that would leave them fighting for their lives. But the warriors only sat there, still and patient, their horses pawing the earth as if even the animals understood the gravity of the moment. It was the waiting that broke the men. "Lord Almighty," Clem whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the endless ranks of riders. "We're done for." "Quiet, boy," barked Rourke, though his own hand shook on the butt of his revolver. He tried to sound steady, but his words rang hollow. Everyone could see the fear in his eyes. The men exchanged nervous glances. Some muttered prayers under their breath. One hand, a burly fellow named Harper, suddenly dropped his rifle to the dirt and stepped back from the fence, his face pale. "No gun in the world'll save us from this," he muttered. 300 of 'em. We ain't even 20. We're dead men." His words spread like sparks across dry grass. Another hand shifted uneasily. "Maybe we should ride out." "Make a break for town? Don't you dare move," Whitfield snapped, his voice sharp as a whip. He stormed forward, glaring at his men. "Stand your ground. You break ranks now. You doom us all. They'll see us for the cowards you're acting like." But his words carried more desperation than command. For the first time, his men saw the cracks in his armor. His cigar trembled between his fingers, the ash scattering across his boots. He barked orders louder, faster, as if volume alone could hold the men together. Meanwhile, Cochise and his warriors remained utterly still. Not a single hand fidgeted, not a single horse was urged forward. Their discipline was terrifying, and it was that very calmness that shredded the ranch hands' nerves. The panic grew. Harper took another step back. "You can stay if you want, Whitfield, but I'm not dying for your stubborn pride." He spat in the dirt and strode toward the stables. "Get back here!" Whitfield roared, raising his pistol. The ranch hands froze, watching in shock as their boss leveled the weapon not at the Apache, but at one of his own men. "I'll put you in the ground before I let you shame me in front of them." Harper stopped, his jaw tightening, then slowly raised his hands and backed toward the bunkhouse instead. The message was clear. Whitfield would rather kill his own than let the Apache see weakness. But the others were rattled. Clem whispered urgently to Rourke, "They ain't even attacking." "Maybe they just want to talk. Maybe we should." "Shut your mouth, boy." Rourke snapped, but his eyes flickered with the same thought. If the warriors had wanted blood, the ranch would already be burning. The fact that they waited meant something. Whitfield, however, could not see it. To him, the waiting was humiliation. His face burned red, his pride screaming louder than his fear. He stormed up to the fence line, waving his pistol in the air. "You hear me, Cochise?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "This is my land. You want war, you'll damn well get it." The ranch hands gasped. Several flinched as if the words themselves might bring a rain of arrows. Clem clutched his rifle to his chest, his voice breaking. "Don't Don't provoke 'em, Mr. Whitfield. But Whitfield was beyond reason. His pride had blinded him, and his men could see it. For the first time, they began to doubt whether their boss would lead them to survival or to slaughter. Then Cochise moved. It was only a gesture, simple and calm. He raised his spear slightly, its red bands catching the morning light. The warriors behind him shifted, not forward, not to attack, but in unison, as though reminding the ranch that every single man there was ready, disciplined, and waiting for their leader's word. The ranch hands felt their stomachs drop. If that spear fell forward, if Cochise so much as twitched, it would be the end of them all. The panic hit its peak. Some men nearly broke and ran. Others raised their rifles halfway, torn between firing and freezing. The ranch had become a powder keg, and Whitfield's reckless shouting was the spark. Cochise's eyes, steady and cold, locked on Whitfield. He still said nothing. His silence was louder than any war cry, a silence that told the ranchers, "We do not fear you. You should fear us." And deep inside, the men did. The standoff stretched on, the air thick with dust and dread. The Apache sat motionless, their eyes sharp as arrows, while the ranch hands trembled behind the fence. At the center of it all stood Whitfield, red-faced, pistol waving, his pride raging louder than his reason. "Speak, damn you!" he shouted at Cochise, the words cracking in his throat. "This is my land, my ranch. You think to scare me with numbers?" But his voice, shrill and desperate, betrayed him. The ranch hands saw it. His bravado was only a mask, and behind it was raw fear. Their leader, the man who had promised to keep them safe, was unraveling before their eyes. Cochise did not answer. He sat tall and silent, his spear glinting in the morning light. 300 warriors waited on his word, still as stone. The silence pressed harder with every second, and the men of Double Creek felt it gnaw at their nerves like wolves at a carcass. It was Clem, the youngest of them all, who cracked first. His voice came in a trembling whisper, almost swallowed by the stillness. "Mr. Whitfield, please, don't. They ain't here to fight. If they wanted blood, we'd already be dead." Whitfield whipped around, his eyes blazing. "Shut your mouth, boy. You'll speak when spoken to." But Clem didn't back down. His knees were shaking, his hands clutching his rifle so tight his knuckles went white, yet he stood his ground. The fear in his voice was real, but so was the conviction. "Don't you see it?" Clem said, louder now, looking from Whitfield to the other ranch hands. "They're waiting. They're giving us a chance. If we fire the first shot, it'll be the last thing we ever do." The ranch hands exchanged uneasy glances. The boy was right, and they knew it. The Apache could have stormed the ranch in minutes. The only reason they hadn't was because their leader was holding them back. But Whitfield's pride was a wall too thick to break. He sneered at Clem, his finger twitching on the trigger of his revolver. "You think you know more than me, boy? I've been fighting these people since before you could hold a rifle. They only understand one thing: force. If we show weakness..." "Force?" A new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Every head turned, riding slowly up the dirt. Rode from the river was Daniel Hayes. His horse was coated in dust from a hard ride, and his clothes were torn, but he sat straight in the saddle, calm, steady, his eyes fixed on the scene before him. The ranch hands gasped. "Hayes!" Clem blurted, relief flooding his face. Whitfield's face darkened. "You've got some gall showing your face here, boy. I fired you." Daniel ignored him. He rode past the men at the gate, straight up to the fence line, where Whitfield stood puffed up with false courage. The Apache shifted slightly, watching, curious. Cochise's eyes narrowed, recognizing the man who had knelt by the wounded dog 2 nights before. Daniel dismounted slowly, his movements calm, deliberate, meant to show respect. He placed his rifle on the ground and raised his empty hands. The ranch hands murmured nervously, but Daniel didn't flinch. He stepped forward until he stood between Whitfield and Cochise's spear. "Whitfield," Daniel said, his voice clear but steady. "You're about to lead these men to slaughter. Look at them. They're terrified, and they have every reason to be. Get out of my way!" Whitfield spat, trying to shove him aside. "This is my ranch, my land, my fight." Daniel stood firm, his eyes locked on Whitfield's. "This isn't your land. It never was. You treat these people like dirt, and now they've come to remind you who they are. If you want to throw your life away, that's your choice. But don't drag these men down with you." The ranch hands stirred uneasily. Clem nodded faintly, his young face alight with hope. Rourke lowered his rifle a fraction, his jaw tight with uncertainty. For the first time since the Apache arrived, the men began to wonder if Whitfield wasn't the leader they needed. Maybe it was Hayes, the boy who had risked his job for a dog, the one man who seemed to understand that this moment wasn't about pride, but survival. Whitfield's face burned crimson, his pride battling his fear. His pistol wavered, and for a heartbeat, it seemed he might turn it on Daniel. But before he could, Cochise moved. The great chief lowered his spear, slow and deliberate. The gesture was simple, but its meaning was clear. "We are watching. We are waiting. Speak wisely." Daniel took a breath, then turned his gaze from Whitfield to Cochise. His voice carried across the silent standoff. "My name is Daniel Hayes," he said steadily. "2 nights ago I helped your dog, not because I wanted reward or thanks, but because it was the right thing to do. I don't know your ways, but I know this: killing won't heal anything here today." The warriors shifted again, murmuring among themselves. Cochise's dark eyes softened just enough to show recognition. He had not forgotten. Whitfield sputtered, "Don't you dare!" But it was too late. The power had shifted. The ranch hands were no longer looking to Whitfield. They were looking to Daniel Hayes. The silence stretched again, but now it was different. It was waiting for a choice. Would Whitfield cling to his pride and spark a massacre, or would Daniel's courage open the door to peace? The world seemed to hang on a thread. 300 Apache warriors sat astride their horses, silent and still, their eyes fixed on the ranch yard. The ranch hands clutched their rifles but dared not move. Whitfield's pistol shook in his grip. And there, between them all, stood Daniel Hayes, his hands empty, his voice the only bridge between war and peace. The silence broke with a single sound: the steady clop of Cochise's horse as the chief urged it forward. He rode alone, leaving his warriors behind. His face was carved from stone, unreadable, yet commanding a presence so powerful the ranch hands instinctively stepped back. Cochise stopped just short of the fence. His gaze swept the ranchers, lingered on Whitfield, then settled on Daniel. For a moment, no one spoke. The world held its breath. Finally, in deep, measured English, Cochise said, "You." He pointed his spear toward Daniel. "You help the dog." The words struck like thunder. The ranch hands gasped. Even Whitfield's jaw dropped. Daniel swallowed but held his ground. "Yes," he said. His voice trembled, but he forced strength into it. "I helped because it was right." Cochise nodded slowly, then turned his gaze to Whitfield. His eyes burned like coals. "But you," he said, his tone sharp as steel, "you strike, you curse, you drive us from water, from land, you call us dogs." Whitfield's pride roared back, though his fear was plain. "This is my ranch, my land. I built it with my own hands." Cochise's voice boomed. "You build on blood. You take what was ours. No more." The words rippled through the warriors. Behind him, they raised their spears and rifles, a wave of motion that sent terror flooding the ranch yard. The men of Double Creek flinched, bracing for the storm. But then Cochise raised his hand, and the warriors froze. Silence fell again. Daniel stepped forward, heart hammering. "Chief Cochise," he said carefully, "we can't change the past, but we can choose today. If there must be punishment, let it fall on the man who wronged you, not on these men who only work his land." The ranch hands stared, wide-eyed. Whitfield whirled on Daniel, his face crimson. "Traitor! You'd sell me out to savages?" "No," Daniel said firmly. "You did that yourself. Every cruel word, every strike of the whip, every drop of water you denied them. You've been begging for this day." Clem's voice broke in, trembling but clear. "Hayes is right. We all saw it. You brought this on us." One by one, the ranch hands lowered their rifles. Not all spoke, but their silence was consent. Their loyalty to Whitfield had cracked. Now their eyes turned to Daniel. Whitfield staggered back, realization crashing down. He was alone. He raised his pistol in desperation, aiming it at Daniel. "If I'm going down, you're coming with me." The shot never came. With a cry, Rourke lunged forward and knocked Whitfield's arm aside. The pistol discharged harmlessly into the sky. In an instant, Clem and two others wrestled Whitfield to the ground. He cursed and kicked, but they held him down. Cochise watched, silent, his expression unreadable. When Whitfield was subdued, the chief finally spoke again. "You understand?" he said to Daniel. "Blood calls for blood." Daniel nodded slowly, his heart pounding. "I know, but mercy is stronger. Let these men live. Let them learn. Show them that the Apache are more than enemies." For a long moment, Cochise studied him. The weight of centuries of conflict hung in the air. Then, at last, the chief lowered his spear. "Because of you," he said gravely, "there will be no fire here today." A collective gasp rose from the ranch yard. Clem's knees nearly buckled with relief. Rourke released a shaky breath. Even. The horses seemed to sense the change, stamping the ground as the tension eased. Cochise turned his gaze to Whitfield, who lay panting in the dust. "But this one," the chief said, his voice cold, "is banished. If he stays, the land will burn." With that, Cochise wheeled his horse and raised his arm. The 300 warriors, as one, turned their mounts and rode away, their thunderous departure shaking the earth. Within minutes, the horizon was empty, and the ranch yard lay in stunned silence. The men released Whitfield, who scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with fury and shame. He glared at Daniel, but his power was gone. His men no longer followed him. One by one, they turned away, their respect shattered. Whitfield mounted his horse without a word. Alone, abandoned, he rode out the gate and into the dust, swallowed by the empty plains.